The letter was in her hand before I could stop her. She was standing on the stepladder, crowbar in one grip, a folded piece of paper in the other. And she looked at me like she had just pulled a pin from a grenade and wasn't sure whether to throw it or hold on. "Owen," she said quietly, "there's something inside this wall." And in that single second, standing in the doorway of a room I hadn't slept in for 3 years, I knew whatever was written on that paper was going to rearrange every version of the past I had built my grief around. My name is Owen Ashford. I'm 34 years old. I teach high school English in a small town called Harlan, about 40 minutes south of Lexington, Kentucky. It's the kind of town where everyone knows your name but has the decency to pretend they don't know your business. I've lived here my whole life. My parents raised me in a white clapboard house on Elm Creek Road, and when they moved to Florida 6 years ago, I bought the house from them because I couldn't imagine anyone else living in the kitchen where my mother taught me how to make cornbread. Claire and I got married in the backyard of that house. There were 60 people, white folding chairs, and a thunderstorm that rolled in 10 minutes after we said our vows. Everyone ran for the porch, and Claire stood in the rain laughing with her arms out, her dress soaked through, her hair stuck to her face. And I thought I had never seen anything more beautiful in my life. But let me slow down, because you need to understand something before the rest of this makes sense. Claire died 2 years and 7 months ago. Ovarian cancer. She was 29. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday, and she was gone by the following spring. 14 months from the first scan to the last breath, I held her hand in a hospital bed that was too small for the size of what was leaving the world. And when she closed her eyes for the final time, a part of me closed with her. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's the only way to explain why her room stayed exactly as she left it for almost 3 years. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her cardigan draped over the chair by the window, a glass of water that I eventually poured out but never moved from the spot where she last set it down. The bed was still made the way she made it. Hospital corners, a habit she picked up from her mother. I slept on the couch for the first 6 months. Then I moved into the spare bedroom down the hall. I never went into our room except to stand in the doorway sometimes at night and look at the empty bed and wonder how a space could feel so full of someone who wasn't there anymore. People told me I needed to let go. My sister said it gently. My friends said it carefully. My therapist said it directly. And they were all right. But being right and being ready are two different countries. And I didn't have a passport to the second one. Then, in August, something shifted. I don't know what caused it exactly. Maybe it was the start of a new school year. Maybe it was turning 34 and realizing I had spent nearly a tenth of my life sleeping in a room I didn't belong in. Maybe it was the afternoon I came home from work and found a bird trapped in the hallway, fluttering against the window of Claire's closed door like it was trying to get in. And I thought even the birds know this room is stuck. I called a contractor. Not a big company, just a local renovation person someone at work had recommended. The name on the card was Elise. She picked up on the third ring, and her voice was calm and direct in a way that made me trust her before I'd even said what I needed. "I want to renovate a bedroom," I told her. "It hasn't been touched in a while." She didn't ask why. She just said, "I can come look at it Thursday if that works for you." Thursday came, and I spent the morning cleaning the rest of the house like I was preparing for a first date, which I wasn't, but the anxiety felt the same. When she knocked, I opened the door and found a woman in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid, work boots that had seen real work, and a tape measure clipped to her belt like it belonged there. She had a small scar on her left eyebrow and steady gray eyes that looked at me without pity or curiosity, just the kind of neutral attention that a good carpenter gives to a piece of wood before deciding what it wants to become. "Owen," she said. "Elise, show me the room." I led her down the hallway. My hand hesitated on the doorknob the way it always did. She noticed but didn't comment. I pushed the door open and stepped aside. Elise walked in slowly. She looked at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. She ran her hand along the window frame and pressed her thumb against the baseboard in the corner. She opened the closet and looked up at the shelf. She did all of this without touching anything on the nightstand or the chair or the bed. She understood, without being told, that the room had a geography of grief, and she was only there to deal with the structure. "Good bones," she said. "What do you want it to become?" Nobody had asked me that question. Everyone had asked me when I was going to change the room, when I was going to move on, when I was going to take her things away. Nobody had asked me what I wanted the room to become. I didn't have an answer ready, so I said the truest thing I could think of. Something that lets me remember her without making me feel like I'm drowning. Elise nodded once, wrote something in a small notebook, and said, "I can work with that." She started the following Monday. I offered to clear out Claire's things over the weekend, and I did. Most of them. I packed the clothes into boxes and drove them to the donation center. I put the books on the shelf in the living room. I kept the reading glasses, the cardigan, and a bottle of her perfume that still smelled like her when I opened the cap. The rest I let go, and it hurt the way pulling a splinter hurts. Sharp and necessary and better once it's done. Elise arrived at 8 a.m. with a truck full of tools and a thermos of coffee. She worked alone, which surprised me. I asked if she needed a crew. She shook her head. "I work better by myself. Fewer opinions, cleaner lines." I left for work each morning and came home each evening to find the room in a different stage of transformation. The first week, she stripped the wallpaper, revealing the original plaster beneath, cracked and yellowed but solid. She sanded the floor down to the bare wood and sealed it with something that smelled like pine and made the whole house feel different, like a window had been opened somewhere. The second week, she rebuilt the window seat that had been broken since before I bought the house. She did it with reclaimed oak from a barn in Jessamine County, and when I ran my hand across the finished surface, it was so smooth it felt like touching water. We started talking during that second week, not about Claire, not at first, about other things. She told me she had learned carpentry from her grandfather, who had built half the barns in the county before his hands gave out from arthritis. She told me she had gone to college in Cincinnati for 2 years, studied architecture, and dropped out because she said she couldn't stand designing buildings she would never touch with her own hands. She wanted to feel the wood, to smell the sawdust, to know that the thing she made would outlast the day she made it. I told her about teaching, about the kids who hated English until they read something that cracked them open, about a boy named Marcus who wrote a poem about his father leaving that was so raw and honest. I had to step into the hallway to collect myself before I could respond. She listened the way she worked, with full attention and no wasted movement. By the third week, I started coming home earlier. I told myself it was because I wanted to check on the progress, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that the house felt different when she was in it. Not just the room she was changing, but the air itself. Like her presence was sanding down something rough inside the walls I had built around my own life. One afternoon I came home and heard music coming from the room. She had brought a small portable speaker, and it was playing something instrumental, a slow piano piece that drifted through the hallway like smoke. I stood outside the door and listened, and through the gap I could see her kneeling on the floor, measuring a piece of oak with her grandfather's tape measure, humming along to the melody. She looked up and saw me watching. "Sorry," she said. "I work better with music. I can turn it off." "Don't," I said. "It sounds like the room needed it." She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when I said something that surprised her, and then she went back to measuring, but I saw the corner of her mouth lift, just barely. And I carried that half smile with me for the rest of the evening, like something I had found on the ground and decided to keep. The next day I found a note on the kitchen counter written on a scrap of sandpaper. "The baseboard in the hallway is loose. I fixed it. You're welcome. E." I put the scrap of sandpaper in my desk drawer, and I couldn't explain why, except that it was the first time in 3 years that someone had left a note in my house that wasn't a condolence card. There was an evening during that third week when it rained so hard that the power went out. Elise was still working when it happened. I heard her curse softly in the dark, then the click of a flashlight. I brought candles from the kitchen and set them on the floor of the room, and for about 20 minutes we sat in candlelight surrounded by exposed plaster and sawdust, listening to the rain hammer the roof, not talking, just sitting. The candlelight made the room look like it belonged to a different century, softer, older, kinder. "This is what houses used to feel like," she said quietly, "before we lit up every corner and left nothing in shadow. You think shadows are a good thing. I think some things need shadow to be seen properly. Like wood grain. You can't see the depth of wood grain in overhead light. You need the angle. You need the darkness next to the light." She was talking about carpentry, but I heard something else in it, something that made me look at her face in the flickering candlelight and see the depth of a person I had been looking at for 3 weeks, but was only now beginning to really see. One evening I brought home takeout and asked if she wanted to stay for dinner. She hesitated, and I saw something cross her face. A careful calculation, the kind of math a person does when they're trying to figure out whether kindness is safe to accept. "Sure," she said finally, "but I'm eating on the porch. I've got sawdust in places sawdust shouldn't be." We sat on the front porch with paper plates on our laps and watched the sun go down behind the tree line. She ate quietly and neatly, and when she was done, she folded her napkin into a perfect square and set it on top of her plate. I noticed she did everything with this kind of deliberate care, as if the way you fold a napkin says something about the way you treat the world. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The room. The woman it belonged to. What was she like?" I was quiet for a long time. The cicadas filled the silence. I looked at the yard where we had gotten married, at the spot where the folding chairs had been, at the patch of grass where Claire had stood in the rain. "She was the kind of person who made you feel like you were the most interesting thing in any room," I said. "Even when you knew you weren't." She taught kindergarten. She could make a 5-year-old believe they were capable of anything. She could make me believe it too. I paused. If you've ever tried to describe someone you loved to someone who never met them, you know the impossible weight of it. Every word feels like a wrong turn. Every adjective falls short. On our first date, I continued, she told me she believed that every person carries one question their whole life that they're afraid to ask out loud. She said hers was whether the people she loved actually needed her, or just got used to having her around. I told her that was the saddest question I'd ever heard, and she laughed and said that's why she never asks it out loud. Elise looked at me with those steady gray eyes. She sounds like she was worth the grief. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about Claire, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not a crack, not a break, but a settling. like a house adjusting to a new foundation. The fourth week is when she found the letter. Elise was replacing a section of damaged plaster near the window. The wall had water damage from a leak that predated my parents' ownership of the house. And when she pulled away the crumbling section, she found a small hollow space between the outer wall and the interior plaster. Inside the hollow was a folded piece of paper, yellowed but intact, sealed in a plastic sandwich bag as if someone had deliberately protected it from moisture and time. She was on the stepladder when I came through the door. I saw the bag in her hand and the look on her face, and I stopped in the doorway. "Owen," she said, "there's something inside this wall." She climbed down and handed it to me. I opened the bag and unfolded the paper. It was Claire's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The slightly tilted letters? The way she always pressed too hard on the pen so the words looked almost engraved? The letter was dated 5 weeks before she died. My hands were shaken. I looked at Elise. She was already stepping back, giving me space, heading for the door. "I'll be on the porch," she said. I sat down on the bare floor of the room my wife had slept in, the room that was half demolished and half rebuilt, and I read the letter. "Owen, I know you're going to find this one day. Maybe not soon, maybe not for years. But I know you, and I know eventually you'll change this room. Because you're braver than you think you are, even when you don't feel it. I need to tell you something I never had the courage to say out loud. I knew before the diagnosis that something was wrong. I felt it in my body for months before I went to the doctor, and I didn't go because I was afraid that knowing would make it real. By the time I finally went, it was already too far. I am so sorry. I stole time from us because I was scared, and I will carry that guilt into whatever comes next. But that's not why I'm writing this. I'm writing this because I need you to hear something from me, from my own hand, in my own words. Not from a grief counselor, or a well-meaning friend, or a book someone gives you about loss. You are going to want to stop living. You are going to want to close this room, and close yourself inside it, and stay there with the version of me that still exists in the space, between the walls. Don't. Please don't. The love we had was real, and it was beautiful, and it was enough. But it was not the last chapter of your story. It was one chapter, the best one I'll ever know, but not your last. When you're ready, and you'll know when you're ready because you'll be changing this room, I need you to let someone in, not to replace me. No one can replace me, and we both know I'm saying that with a smile. But to stand beside you in the next part of your life, the part I won't get to see but that I want for you so badly it makes my chest ache, you deserve a kitchen that smells like breakfast on a Sunday. You deserve someone who will argue with you about which movie to watch and then fall asleep 10 minutes in. You deserve to be loved again, Owen. Not because I wasn't enough, but because you are too much life to waste on an empty room. Whoever finds this letter with you, whatever woman is standing in this room with a hammer, or a paintbrush, or a roll of wallpaper, look at her, really look at her, and ask yourself if maybe, just maybe, she's the reason you finally opened this door. I love you. I will always love you, but I love you enough to let you go. Claire, read it 3 times. By the second time, I couldn't see the words through my tears. By the third time, I was sitting on the floor with my back against the wall and my face in my hands, crying in a way I hadn't cried since the night she died, not the polite, controlled grief I had learned to perform for other people, but the raw, ugly, gasping kind that comes from a place you forgot existed, because you boarded it up and painted over it and pretended the room wasn't there. Elise came back inside after 20 minutes. She didn't knock. She just appeared in the doorway, saw me on the floor, and sat down beside me without a word. She didn't touch me. She didn't say she was sorry. She just sat there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her shoulder near mine, and let me fall apart in a room that was half my past and half my future. I don't know how long we sat there. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Time doesn't work properly when you're holding a letter from a dead woman who saw the future more clearly than you can see the present. At some point, I handed her the letter. I didn't plan to. I just held it out and she took it and read it in silence. When she finished, she folded it carefully along the original creases and placed it on the floor between us. She didn't say anything about what it said. She didn't need to. Her silence was more honest than any words would have been, and I understood. Then that this was a woman who knew the difference between a moment that needs talking and a moment that needs holding. When the crying stopped, we sat in the quiet for a long time. The late afternoon light came through the window and cast long golden rectangles across the bare floor. Sawdust floated in the beams like tiny planets. "She wrote you a letter," Elise said finally. "It wasn't a question. She told me to let go," I said. My voice sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. "Are you going to—" I looked at the letter on the floor between us, then at the room around me, the stripped walls, the new window seat, the floor that smelled like pine. Then I looked at Elise, sitting beside me in her work boots and her dusty flannel shirt with sawdust in her auburn hair. And I thought about what Claire had written. "Whatever woman is standing in this room, look at her, really look at her." "I don't know how," I whispered. "That's okay," she said. "Neither do I." She wasn't talking about the room. Neither was I. The renovation took 2 more weeks after that. Something had changed between us. Not in any dramatic way, but in the small gestures that accumulate like sawdust in the corners of a room. She started calling me before she came over to ask if I needed anything from the hardware store. I started making a second cup of coffee in the morning and leaving it on the counter for when she arrived. Still hot, black, 1 sugar. We moved around each other in the house with a new kind of awareness. The way two people do when they've both acknowledged that the space between them is no longer just air. Elise finished the walls in a warm white that made the room feel like morning. She installed new shelves where Claire's bookshelf had been, and I put a few of Claire's favorite books on them, not as a shrine, but as a memory. The way you keep a photograph on a mantle because it makes you smile, not because it makes you cry. She built a reading nook into the window seat, with cushions covered in a deep blue fabric that reminded me of the sky right before the stars come out. And on the last day, when the room was finished, she hung the door back on its hinges and stood back to look at her work. I stood beside her. The room was beautiful. It was completely different from what it had been, but it wasn't empty. It had warmth and texture and light, and it felt like the kind of place where someone could begin again. Thank you, I said. The word felt pathetically small for what she had done. She hadn't just rebuilt a room. She had rebuilt the architecture of my grief, taken it apart, beam by beam, and put it back together in a shape I could live inside. You're welcome, she said. Then she started packing her tools. I watched her wrap her chisels in a leather roll, stack her clamps in a wooden box, coil her extension cord with the practiced speed of someone who has done it 10,000 times. Each movement was precise and unhurried, the way she did everything, and I realized I was memorizing the details because I was afraid this was the last time I would see them. Elise, she looked up. Do you want to stay for dinner? Not on the porch this time. Inside? She studied me for a moment. I could see the calculation again, the careful weighing of risk and want. But this time, something in her face softened, the way a wall softens when you sand it down to the wood beneath. Inside sounds good, she said. I made pasta because it was the only thing I knew how to make well. And she sat at the kitchen table and watched me cook with her chin resting on her hand. We talked about everything except the letter. We talked about her grandfather and my students. We talked about the sound rain makes on a tin roof and whether it counts as music. We talked about the first time we each realized we were lonely, and how strange it is that loneliness can feel so normal you forget it's there, until someone walks into your house, and the contrast makes it suddenly visible, like switching on a light in a room you didn't know was dark. After dinner, we sat on the porch again. The night was warm, and the sky was full of stars, and somewhere down the road a dog was barking at something only it could see. I should tell you something, Elise said. Okay, when I took this job, I almost turned it down. A friend of mine told me about you, about what happened with your wife. And I thought, I don't want to walk into someone's grief and make it worse. I've done that before. Not on purpose, but it happens when you work in people's home. You see things you're not supposed to see. You become part of a story you didn't sign up for. She paused. But I came anyway, and I'm glad I did. Why did you come? She looked at me sideways. Because he also told me you were kind, and I've learned that kind men are harder to find than good lumber. I laughed, and the sound surprised me because it came from somewhere deep and real, a place that had been silent for a very long time. She smiled, and for the first time, the smile reached past her careful composure and showed me something unguarded, a warmth she usually kept behind the same walls she was so good at tearing down. Claire's letter, I said. She told me to look at the person standing in the room. Really look at her. Elise went very still, and I'm looking. The silence between us was not empty. It was full, the way a room is full after you've filled it with everything it needs and nothing it doesn't. She reached over and took my hand, and her grip was firm and calloused and warm. The hand of a woman who built things for a living, and I held it like it was the first solid thing I had touched in 3 years. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't need to. What happened was smaller and more important than a kiss. It was a decision, made in silence, by two people sitting on a porch in the dark, to stop building walls and start building something else. The weeks that followed were slow and deliberate, the way good carpentry is slow and deliberate. Elise didn't move in. She didn't rush. She came by for dinner 3 times a week, then 4, then 5. She brought me a plant for the window of the new room because she said every room needs one living thing in it besides the person sleeping there. I graded papers at the kitchen table while she read on the window seat she had built with her own hands. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, and the silence was comfortable, like a well-fitted joint that holds without glue. There were small moments that mattered more than either of us admitted. The morning she showed up with 2 coffees and handed me one without asking how I take it. And it was exactly right. Black, 1 sugar. I asked her how she knew. I watched you make it every morning for 3 weeks, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The evening, I was struggling with a stuck drawer in the kitchen, and she walked over, pulled a chisel from her back pocket like a magician producing a coin, tapped the joint twice, and the drawer slid free. You just carry tools everywhere, I asked. You just live with stuck drawers? She said. There was the night she called me at 11 o'clock because her truck broke down on Route 68, and I drove 20 minutes in the dark to pick her up. She was sitting on the tailgate with her arms crossed, and when my headlights found her, she looked annoyed and relieved in equal measure. She got in my truck and said, I could have walked. I said, I know. We drove home in silence. And when I dropped her at her apartment, she paused with her hand on the door handle and said, Thank you, Owen. The way she said my name made it sound like something she had been practicing saying in her head and had finally let out into the open air. My sister, Jenny, came to visit the first week of October. She walked into the house and looked at the finished room, and the plant on the window seat, and the 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter, and turned to me with wide eyes. "Owen," she said. "Who is she?" "She's the contractor who renovated the room. Contractors don't leave coffee mugs on your counter." I didn't argue because she was right. Jenny stayed for the weekend, and on Saturday evening, Elise came over for dinner. I watched my sister study her across the table the way a jeweler studies a stone, turning it in the light, looking for flaws, and I watched Elise handle the inspection with quiet grace, answering questions without performing, being herself without apology. After dinner, while Elise was washing dishes, Jenny pulled me onto the porch. "She's nothing like Claire," she said. "I know. That's not a criticism." Claire was lightning. "This woman is an oak tree. Different kind of beautiful." She squeezed my arm. Claire would have liked her. I looked through the window at Elise standing at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scrubbing a pot with the same focused attention she gave to everything. And I thought about the letter on the bookshelf and the words written in my dead wife's handwriting. "I need you to let someone in." One Saturday morning in October, I woke up early and drove to the hardware store. I bought a small brass frame, simple and unpolished, the kind of thing Elise would approve of because it didn't try to be more than it was. I went home and took Claire's letter out of the drawer where I had been keeping it. I read it one more time, standing in the morning light of the room that Elise had rebuilt, and I let the words settle into me, not as a wound, but as a gift. Then I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the frame, and set it on the bookshelf beside Claire's favorite novel. Not hidden, not displayed. Just there, part of the room, part of the story. That afternoon, Elise came over. She walked into the room to water the plant and saw the framed letter on the shelf. She stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to me, and her gray eyes were bright with something I hadn't seen in them before. "She must have loved you very much," she whispered. "She did," I said, "enough to let me find you." Elise pressed her lips together and looked away, and I saw her blink hard. Once, twice, the way someone does when they're trying to hold something in that wants very badly to come out. I crossed the room and pulled her into my arms, and she let me, her face against my chest, her hands gripping the back of my shirt, and we stood there in the room that had once been a tomb and was now full of morning light and a living plant and a letter from a woman who had loved me enough to write the words I needed to hear 3 years after she was gone. When she pulled back, she wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, a rough carpenter's gesture that somehow made the tears look braver. "I wasn't looking for this," she said. "Neither was I. I don't know how to be in love with someone who's still in love with someone else." I took her face in my hands, gently, the way you hold something you've built from scratch and don't want to break. "I will always love Claire, but I'm not in love with a ghost. I'm in love with the woman who walked into that room with a crowbar and showed me what it looks like to build something new on top of something that broke." She closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek and caught on my thumb. "That's the best thing anyone's ever said to me," she whispered. "And I'm furious that you're an English teacher because I'll never be able to compete with that." I laughed, and she laughed, and we stood there laughing and crying in a room full of sawdust and sunlight and second chances. That evening, we sat on the window seat together and watched the sun go down over Harlan. The trees were turning, gold and red, and the kind of orange that only exists for 2 weeks in October before it's gone. Elise leaned her head against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and she said something so quiet, I almost missed it. "Oh, and yeah, I think your house has good bones." I kissed the top of her head and closed my eyes, and listened to the wind moving through the trees outside, the window of a room that had taken me 3 years to open, and I thought about Claire standing in the rain at our wedding with her arms out and her dress soaked through, laughing, and I knew she was laughing still, not because I had moved on, but because I had finally moved forward.